Hello everyone and welcome back to the Bibliothèque. My name is Vervain and today I am in the history section to tell you about our latest acquisition, which is Jingo by Terry Pratchett. This is one of the Discworld novels, but as with most Discworld novels, it's a standalone novel. So what that means is even if you have never read a Discworld novel before, don't worry, you can just pick up Jingo and start reading and you will still understand the storyline. So in this video, as usual, I'm just going to start by giving you an overview of what's going on. I'm then going to give you my thoughts on some of the topics that come up in the book, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of Discworld trivia, and finally I'm going to talk about the actual formatting and writing of the book. Okay, so our story begins out in the ocean, and we have two fishermen who are minding their own business. So firstly, one fisherman is from Ankh-Morpork, which is the city-state that forms the background for a lot of the Discworld novels. And the second fisherman is from the kingdom of Klatch, which has a vast desert empire. So these two fishermen are just, minding their own business, fishing, and then suddenly an island rises up from the ocean. So this is the island of Leshp, and it does periodically rise and sink back down under the sea. Today it's decided to rise again. And so these fishermen who were, just minding their own business initially are now going to race to claim Leshp for their own country because it is a strategically located island and it also has a lot of natural resources. So they both get to the island at about the same time. They start squabbling about whose it is, who got there first, who saw it first. Of course, they can't agree, so they then both row back home as fast as they can to go and tell their respective rulers that Leshp has resurfaced and that they, of course, need to hurry up and go claim it. So in the last little while, there has been peace between Ankh-Morpork and Klatch, but unfortunately, neither side is willing to cede this new island Leshp to the other side, and so it looks as if there's going to be a war between the two kingdoms over this territory. And the majority of this book is about the partition of Ankh-Morpork, Lord Vetinari, and the Chief of Police, Sam Vimes, and their efforts to try to stop a war before it occurs because the cities just can't afford, they financially cannot afford to go to war. Okay, so that's an overview of what happens in this book. I'm now just going to talk about some of the themes that came up in it. So I'm just going to periodically read you a few excerpts from the text, and then I'm just going to come back and elaborate with my thoughts on that part of the text. So it looks as if there's going to be a war. And before you can go to war with someone, you need to vilify them. You need to justify why they deserve for you to do bad things to them. Because if you respect someone or if you like someone, you're not going to go to war with them, you're not going to harm them in any way. So one of the things that comes up in Jingo pretty early is the idea of prejudice versus real-world experience. So I'm just going to read you a quick excerpt to provide an example of what I want to talk about, and then I'll come back and give you my thoughts. "Looks like we're going to be in a fight, Sarge," said Nobby. "Won't last long. Lots of cowards, the Klatchians," said Colin. "The moment they taste a bit of cold steel, they're legging it away over the sand." Sergeant Colin had had a broad education. He'd been to the school of "My Dad Always Said" and the college of "It Stands to Reason," and was now a postgraduate student at the University of "What Some Bloke in the Pub Told Me." Okay, so there are a couple of things that I want to talk about based on this scene. Firstly, we can see that Sergeant Colin has a lot of opinion on the Klatchians, but at this point he doesn't have very much personal experience or very many one-to-one interactions with people from Klatch. So he's got some stereotypes or some prejudice about these people, but it's been my experience that prejudice and stereotypes are not accurate very often, especially as we are going to talk about further in this video that there can be lots of cultural diversity within a group. So just because two people come from Klatch doesn't mean that they share the same cultural background, doesn't mean they have the same personalities, but I will get to that a little bit later on. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is I used to know someone who always used to say, my auntie says this, my auntie says that, my auntie knows best. And so when I read this scene when Colin says, my dad always said, I just thought, yeah, I know someone like this, or I used to know someone like this. And they were so stubborn. If they got it into their mind that 1 + 1 made 3, and their auntie had told them that 1 + 1 makes 3, then you better believe 1 + 1 makes 3. And even if you were a mathematician, even if you tried to show them the working out, they wouldn't respect your authority, they wouldn't respect your personal experience. If their auntie said, then that's the end of it. Their auntie says. So it just reminded me of how frustrating it was to deal with this person. One of the concepts that Jingo covers is where is home for an immigrant? So once Leshp has been discovered and there's news that the countries may go to war to claim this territory for themselves, there's some anti-Clatchian sentiment that rises in Ankh-Morpork, and I'm sure that there's some Ankh-Morporkian resentment rising in Clatch, but this book is mostly based from the Ankh-Morpork perspective. So anyway, there's some resentment of Clatchians, and there are a number of Clatchians who decide that they want to return home for safety reasons. So in particular, we follow one family who moved to Ankh-Morpork many years ago. They now sell some street food. They've been there for many years, but recently their shop has been vandalized, so they're packing up to go home. And the son of the shop owner, the son was born in Ankh-Morpork, and there's a scene where he's like, I've never even been to Clatch. And I think that's really powerful because okay, maybe, his skin color is different, maybe the way he dresses is different from the sort of indigenous people of Ankh-Morpork, if you will, but his home is Ankh-Morpork. That's all he's known, that's where he was raised. He speaks Ankh-Morporkian, all his friends are there. If he goes to Clatch, Clatch will be foreign territory to him. It might be the home of his parents, but for this boy, he doesn't speak the language, he doesn't know anyone there, he doesn't know the layout of the city. So the reason I bring this up is because one thing that I really like in Terry Pratchett's writing is that his works are fictional works. Well, okay, in some places across the multiverse, his books are sold as fictional works. Here at the Netherworld Bibliothèque, which exists in the same multiverse as Ankh-Morpork and as Discworld, yeah, it's just history, so that's why this book is in our history section. But yeah, for some people who, haven't discovered the multiverse, who still think they live in a universe, haven't discovered how to travel through space and time, they think it's fiction. But to get back onto my point, although this is a, fiction book, I think you can still read it and reflect on your society or reflect on other countries that you're aware of and be like, yeah, okay, we're talking about Ankh-Morpork, but there are some things that are going on here that could be happening in other places across the multiverse as well. So with the issue of immigration and where is your home, where do people make you feel welcome, where do you belong, yeah, I think those are themes that can play out in numerous places across the multiverse. And that's one of the things that I really like about Terry Pratchett, where he kind of does social commentary sometimes, but it's done in a really subtle way that just makes you reflect. It's not really him preaching, it's not really him pushing an agenda onto you. And if you've watched my review of Bedlam by Derek Landy, I really think Derek Landy could learn a thing or two from Terry Pratchett, because one of my complaints about Bedlam was that it was very obvious what Derek Landy's political views were. It was very obvious what his points of view were about some very real world situations that were unfolding. And my whole criticism was, I'm reading a fiction book, I want to be entertained. If I wanted to know what the news was, if I wanted to know actual real world current events, I would watch the news. So yeah, the point is, as I'm now going to illustrate with some more examples from the book, I really like that Terry Pratchett can make you reflect on what's going on in the world that you live in, but he has really good use of satire and parody, and I think he gets you to reflect in a really subtle, skillful way. My last point now leads into what makes you part of a certain society or part of a certain nation. So I'm just going to read you an excerpt from the book and then I'm going to come back and elaborate. They were Clatchian. At least they were wearing foreign-looking clothes, and one or two of them had caught more sun than you generally got in Ankh-Morpork. The feeling crept over Vimes that Clatch was a very big place in which his city and the whole of the Stowe Plains would be lost. So there must be room in it for all kinds of peoples, including this short chap in the red fez who was practically vibrating with indignation. So I think this ties in really nicely with the previous scenario with the boy saying, but you know, I've never seen Clatch, Ankh-Morpork is my home. So through immigration, through wars in different territories being conquered, you know, so on and so forth, you may have people of all different cultural backgrounds living side by side and being part of the same nation, but they're not part of the same homogenous cultural group. And again, we're just talking about Discworld, or Terry Pratchett is just writing about what happens in Discworld, but I really think this particular paragraph in the book really made me reflect and made me think, yeah, I've seen this scenario play out many times across the multiverse, where you have people of all different walks of life, people from different tribes or different nations who historically don't get along, but through one reason or another are now part of the same country and have to live side by side, but don't necessarily always get along. And that is a good segue leading into the next part of the book that I want to read to you. What the hell's all this noise? He yelled. It was Mr. Gorif and Mr. Wazir having a bit of what you might call an argy-bargy, sir. Someone set fire to someone else's country 200 years ago, Carrot says. What, just now? Soul clutch into me, sir. Anyway, Wazir's gone off with his nose in a sling. Wazir comes from Smaleg, you see, said Carrot, and Mr. Gorif comes from El Harib, and the two countries only stopped fighting 10 years ago. Religious differences. Run out of weapons, said Vimes. Ran out of rocks, sir. They ran out of weapons last century. So as I was saying, just because you can look at a map and say, okay, this is one unified country, that doesn't mean that if you actually visit that country and speak to the locals, you will find a unified peoples. Actually, yeah, I like that. One unified country doesn't mean one unified peoples. Next point. The last point that I want to talk about in terms of topics covered in the book is that of what is right and wrong and how that can change over time. So again, I'm just going to read you a bit from the book and then I'm going to come back and elaborate with my thoughts. It was all so difficult these days, and Lady Sybil came from a class that was not used to difficulty, or at least the kind that couldn't be sorted out by shouting at a servant. 500 years ago, one of her ancestors had cut off a Clatchian's head in battle and had brought it home on a pole, and no one had thought the worse of him, given what the Clatchians would have cut off if they'd have caught him. That seemed straightforward. You fought them, they fought you, everyone knew the rules, and if you got your head cut off, you jolly well didn't blub about it afterwards. So in this scene, we're talking about the rules of engagement in war, and Lady Sybil, who is an aristocrat, and she's the richest lady in Ankh-Morpork, and she is the wife of Sam Vines. Anyway, so the point of this little bit is that it's talking about how people are struggling to adjust to the new normal or to new cultural norms or what is now acceptable. So throughout this book, we find that there's a lot of talk about politics. The word politics in italics appears many times throughout Jingo, and there's a lot of negotiation and a lot of really diplomatic talks because the two nations are really trying to avoid having to go to war. Whereas you can see with Lady Sybil, politics and diplomacy is really a pretty new way for nations to deal with one another. They used to just go to war, like that was what you did, and you got them before they got you. And that really reminds me of the expression that you can't apply the values of today to the societies of yesterday. So I can't take credit for that saying. It is something that I heard a history professor say when he was talking about war. And in particular, sometimes when people would look at historic battles and say, you know, that's barbaric or that's a war crime. And it's like, is it? Because when did the concept of a war crime come along? If these are like really ancient battles before there were rules about how you treat prisoners of war or what type of violence or what types of weapons you can and can't use in a war, if it happened before conventions and legislations were put in place about those things, then no, those ancient societies were not committing war crimes. So you can't apply laws retrospectively. And You have to look at people within their context. You have to look at battles within their context, because you can't apply the values of your society to past societies. They live differently, different things were acceptable. Okay, so that does it in terms of the topics that I wanted to talk about that I raised in Jingo. I now want to talk about the physical book. So I'm going to talk about the cover, and I'm going to talk about the actual writing within the book, and then I'm just going to finish by giving you a little bit of trivia about Ankh-Morpork. Okay, so this cover is by Josh Kirby, who has illustrated a lot of Discworld covers. Once again, I will link to him in the description section if you want to see more of his work. So what you will find with Josh Kirby's Discworld covers is that they depict a scene that actually happens in that book. So I've gotten into the habit of, whenever I pick up a new Discworld novel, I look at the cover and I try to guess what's going to be happening in this book, which characters are going to feature, because the cover always relates to what is happening in the book, which is not something that always happens with every book out there, but it is something that I do like about the Discworld series. So on the cover of Jingo, we can see the opening scene where we have the two fishermen, one from Ankh-Morpork and one from Clatch, and we can see that they're at each other's throats, so to speak, and we can see the island of Lesh has started to resurface. So we have the cockerel and the weather vane, which is the first part of Lesh that resurfaces in the book. And if you look really closely at the weather vane, you can see that the directions that are noted on it are perhaps different to the ones that you're familiar with in your hometown. However, if you're familiar with Discworld, I think you will recognize what these directions are. So now in terms of the writing, one thing that I found to be really novel in this book is that you're able to read when other people are speaking different languages. So normally in other books, if someone is speaking a language that the protagonist doesn't speak, normally it will say something like, the emissary spoke to his party in hushed tones. They then turned around to the antagonist and said blah blah blah, relayed the message. Whereas in this book, if someone is speaking Clatchian, there's a different font used to show when they're speaking Clatchian. So you can hear their conversation basically, and there are times when people are speaking Clatchian because they don't want the antagonist, they don't want the protagonist, or they don't want the main character to understand what they're saying, but you as the reader can understand. So I thought that was something really novel. It's not something I've seen in different books. And also I really like that this book also shows accents. So again, if someone from Clatch is speaking Ankh-Morporkian, but their accent is coming through on certain words, different characters and different fonts are used just where the accent is happening. So I thought that was a really clever idea. I really enjoyed it. And again, it's not something that I've seen previously in any other book. The last thing that I want to talk about is we get a little bit of trivia in this book. We learn how big Ankh-Morpork is. Now, I know it's not very big, it is a city-state, so there was the city of Ankh and the city of Morpork, and they came together and made Ankh-Morpork, but I never knew how big it was. But in this book, we learn that you can walk from one end of Ankh-Morpork to the other in half an hour. That's actually pretty small. I was really surprised to know that. I know it's quite a built-up area. I know people sometimes live in slums, can live in crowded conditions, but yeah, I didn't realize how small it was. But there you go, that's a little bit of trivia that you can learn in Jingo, or that you may have just learned from this video. Anyway, so that does it for today. Thank you very much for stopping by. If you have any thoughts, if you've read this book, if you would like to discuss some of the topics that were raised within Jingo, let me know in the comment section. But otherwise, that's it for today. Thank you for stopping by, and maybe I will see you next time.